Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another of my film reviews on the Olympus OM range of 35mm SLRs. And today we're going to be talking about this little camera here, the Olympus OM10. This was very much sort of a beginner's camera for the Olympus OM range. It wasn't as fancy as the single-digit models like the OM1 and the OM2, which were more sort of geared towards the enthusiastic amateur, shall we say, to almost the professional type photographer. The OM10 was always aimed squarely at the amateur, the enthusiast. A very popular camera in its day. Olympus made thousands of them, and they sold really well. Launched in 1979, and as I say, it was very popular with the amateur photographers because it came in at the right sort of price point. It was quite cheap to buy, and it was a great starting point for anyone interested in getting started in SLR photography. As the camera came out of the box, really it was just an aperture priority only camera, which is interesting. It wasn't manual. So it was quite easy to use for the amateur starting out in photography, because all you had to do was select the aperture on the lens, and then the camera would automatically select a shutter speed to match the aperture that you had chosen on the lens. This made it very easy to use. No complicated worrying about exposure. When you picked an aperture on the lens, it gave a reading in the viewfinder showing what shutter speed, what matching shutter speed the camera had selected. And if the shutter speed in the viewfinder wasn't to your liking, say if you were hand holding the camera and the shutter speed was a bit too low, well, then all you had to do was open up the aperture a bit, and of course the camera would automatically adjust the shutter speed to a faster shutter speed to match the more wide open aperture on the camera. So really just the one control you had to worry about in this camera was the aperture priority auto only as it came out of the box. But there were a few other interesting features about this camera, most notably on the front of the camera. As we see here on the left hand side at the front, there's a couple of interesting looking features here. One looks like a PC socket for flash, and then there's this strange little metal stud here as well. But if you thought that was a PC socket for flash, you'd be mistaken, because the little OM10 had a trick up its sleeve in that although out of the box it was aperture priority only, you could actually convert the camera to manual exposure as well, with the addition of this little thing here, the Olympus manual adapter, which was designed specifically for the OM10. And as you can see, it has a shutter speed dial on it, giving a range of shutter speeds from 1 second right up to 1/1000th of a second. And to attach this little adapter to the camera was quite simple. As you see on this side, there's like a little jack plug there, and all you did was you pushed that little jack plug into the hole that looked like a PC socket and pushed it firmly in, and that attached a manual adapter onto the OM10. And this then meant that the camera could be used in manual exposure as well as auto exposure. So if you wanted to be more creative with your camera and have more control over the shutter speed and the aperture, you could do with the addition of this control, the Olympus manual adapter. Now as we look around the camera, you will see that on the top plate's rather unusual on this camera. As it came out of the box, on the top on the right, there was no conventional shutter speed dial on the top there. Instead, what you have here is the setting for setting the film speed on the camera. As you can see at the minute, this one is currently set to 100 ISO. As you can see, the little 100 there is lined up against the white mark, indicating that the camera is currently set to 100 ISO. If you wanted to alter the film speed setting, say you were using a 400 ISO film, well then what you had to do was lift up that little ring and move it up until the white index mark was against 400, which meant that you now had set the camera's film speed for 400 ISO. Again, if you wanted to move it back, just lift it and set it down, and again the camera was now set back to 100 ISO again. This strange little dial also has 3 other markings on it. One says manual adapter, the middle one says auto, and then it says B on the top. And down here you'll see that there's a little switch with a white index mark on it. Now currently the camera, if that white index mark was up there, then the corresponding white index mark here was set to B. So the camera's shutter would be currently set to the B or bulb setting. If you then moved this little white index mark to the middle, it then lined up with the auto setting on the camera, which was the standard setting for the camera. That meant that the camera was now in aperture priority auto. So as I say, well, that was the standard setting for the camera, and this meant that when you set the aperture on the lens, the camera would then set a corresponding shutter speed. This was the default mode for operating the camera. With the control wheel set to auto, the camera was in aperture priority auto mode. This little dial could also be set down. If you moved it down the way over to there, the corresponding little white mark on the control wheel was now opposite manual adapter. So what that meant was that the manual adapter on the front of the camera came into play, and the camera was now set to manual exposure. In other words, you had control over the shutter speed on the camera via the little shutter speed control on the front, which meant that you had to manually control the shutter speed and the aperture. You would have got a reading in the viewfinder which suggested a shutter speed that you should use for the ISO that you had set on the wheel, and you then had to pick a shutter speed and aperture combination to match that setting that you got on the viewfinder. So you had the option, if you added the manual adapter to the OM10, you then had the option of manual exposure control along with the camera's default aperture priority setting. I say without that little adapter, the camera just was aperture priority only, but with that adapter you then had the option of using either manual exposure or aperture priority, depending on where you had set the little control wheel on the right. As I say, its default setting was with this little switch in the middle and the camera set to auto, which was aperture priority. So whenever you, as I say, selected a shutter speed on the lens, the camera would automatically pick a matching shutter speed to match the aperture that you had chosen. On the left hand side of the camera top plate there is a selector switch. At the minute it's set to off, which means that the camera's metering was turned off. You wouldn't have got any reading in the viewfinder. If you move that switch right round to that position, the camera was then in its self-timer mode. So if you wanted to use the self-timer, then that was where you positioned that switch. When you went up past the off position, you were then went to the on position on the control dial. This switched on the camera's metering, and it was ready to go in either aperture priority or manual, depending on which you had set on the camera. If you moved the little control wheel forward to the check button, this gave an audible and visual check of the battery condition. Not sure if you can hear that, it's quite quiet, but it gave an audible beep. And the front of the camera, the LED lit up on the self-timer on the front, and that gave the condition of the batteries in the camera. Again, the OM10 used the SR44 button cell batteries, 2 button cell batteries, either SR44 or LR44 button cell batteries. So this was the little OM10, a very popular enthusiast's camera of the time, and as I say, it gave you everything that you really needed to get started in 35mm photography. To rewind the film, again it's pretty conventional. On the front you'll see the little R, the lever, little control wheel there. You just move that counterclockwise, and then you were able to flick up the rewind crank on the rewind spool there and rewind your film. Fairly conventional in that way. Again, to open the film back was pretty standard. You just reached over to the film rewind and pulled up the lever, and the back swung open on you. Again, this shutter on the OM10 was a horizontally run cloth shutter, and the speeds in auto and manual ran from 1 second to 1/1000th of a second. So you had quite a range of shutter speeds, certainly very adequate for any task that you might have been doing. As I say, the shutter was horizontally run cloth, and that's it there. So see, it moved along horizontally, and when you fired it, it was horizontally run. An interesting point about the metering on the OM10 was that although it didn't have any fancy flash metering, it just had ordinary computer flash. It didn't have through the lens flash. like the OM2 series and upwards had. The ambient metering in this camera was used Olympus's unique off the film plane metering system, and in that the camera actually metered off the film plane during the exposure, which was unique to Olympus. And you can actually see that if I set the camera to its B setting here and hold the shutter open. Down in there, I'm not sure if you can see it, but there actually the sensor film sensor is actually pointing back towards the film plane. So in other words, whenever the shutter was open on the camera actually metered in real time off the film plane to give a highly accurate reading for exposing film. So that was Olympus's off the film plane metering system, which was very accurate, and as I say, it could do it in real time. As the shutter was open, it actually metered while the shutter was open. On the top again, the flash was a fixed shoe. It wasn't detachable like on the OM1 and the OM2. The hot shoe was fixed, and as you can see, it has two contacts, a central contact and a little contact off to one side. For the Olympus T series of flash guns, either the T20 or the T32 would have fitted in the Olympus hot shoe, and the little contact off to the side just gave an indication in the viewfinder when the flash was ready. Again, the maximum flash sync speed on the OM10 was 1/60th of a second. You couldn't use any higher speed than 1/60th, or the image wouldn't have been exposed properly. So that was the maximum sync speed of the flash on the OM10. The ISO rating on the camera, as you can see on the dial on the top, it ran from 25 ISO up to 1600 ISO. So it had, quite an adequate ISO range for using different films on the camera. The shutter release button, again, it was threaded for standard cable release, so you could have used a standard mechanical cable release on this camera as well. When you bought this camera back in, as I say, '79, it would have come with a standard 50mm lens on it, which is the Zyko 50mm lens, which is a beautifully sharp lens and quite fast because the maximum aperture on it was f1.8. So the lens opened up to f1.8, and although the images were a bit soft at the edges at f1.8, if you stopped it down a stop to f2.8, it certainly bring the image into sharp relief, and from then on downwards, say right down to f16, which was the minimum aperture on the 50mm lens. So a lovely lens, the 50mm Zyko, which was the lens that the camera originally came packaged with back in the day. On the bottom plate, you will see that the camera has a coupling here for a winder. It didn't take the motor drive. Olympus did have a motor drive, but the camera, the OM10, wasn't capable of using the motor drive, but it was capable of attaching a winder to it, either the Olympus Winder 1 or the Winder 2, and that would have engaged the winder there. I can demonstrate that to you shortly here. There is the cover, the plate that covers the batteries. As I said, I've already mentioned them. Two SR44 button cells went in there. And over here you can see the little electrical contacts for the winder. And here's a standard tripod socket. So in order to attach the winder 2 to the camera, you just there was a pin that you engaged, and then you just screwed the winder into the tripod socket, and that attached the Olympus winder 2 to the camera. So with that attached, you could actually shoot up to 2 frames a second with the Olympus OM winder 2 attached to the camera. It did change the handling of the camera quite a bit. It gave you quite a chunky hand grip to hold on to, but it did of course increase the weight of the camera, because it took 4 AA cells in the winder. But quite a nice little accessory, the OM winder, and as I say, it just screwed straight on to the bottom of the camera. Unlike the OM1 and the OM2, the OM10 didn't have a cover over the winder connection. It was just left uncovered like that, although it was dust sealed. But it didn't have a cover plate like the OM1 and the OM2 had. So the OM10, as I say, basically as it came, you had an aperture priority only camera without the manual adapter attached to it. The camera just shot in aperture priority only as it came out of the box. You had to have that little white dot lined up against auto on the control dial, and switch on your metering, and the camera was good to go. You just selected whatever aperture you wanted on the lens, and the camera would choose a matching shutter speed. Aperture priority, very simple to use, and excellent for the beginner into photography. As I say, if as your interest grew in photography and you wanted to take more control over exposure by using manual exposure, then you could have bought the little manual adapter for the camera, attached that to the front, and then with that accessory added to the camera, you increased its versatility, because now it was an aperture priority and manual exposure camera with the little accessory added to it. The camera itself came in 3 variants. This one here is the pretty standard one, which is the chrome body, but they also did it in a black bodied version as well, the OM10 black body, which is quite nice, you know, attractive looking alternative to the chrome bodied version. Again, it takes all the Olympus Zyko range of lenses. This one on this particular body is a Zyko 135, a short telephoto lens. Again, took the manual adapter as well, and it had the rather nice black finish on it, but the camera, the specifications on the camera were exactly the same on the black version as on the chrome version. Absolutely no difference at all. The colour was the only thing. You had the choice of either the black version or the chrome bodied version. There was a third variant of the camera which was called the OM10 Quartz, and the unique feature of this variant of the OM10 was when you turned it round on the back, the camera had a data back attached to the back of it, and with this feature you were able to print the date and the time onto your film. This one here, obviously the batteries have long gone in it, so you're not getting a display of the date and time, which normally would have appeared in that little LCD window there. But if you wanted that feature on the camera, then you could set that up. Of course you could switch it off as well, but if you wanted it on, you could get the date and the time printed onto the exposures on your film via the data back on the camera. I'll say that was the unique feature of the OM10 Quartz variation. Again, it came in a black body coloration with the data back on the back of it. This particular one has the Zyko 28mm lens on it. This is the f3.5 version, which is a wide angle lens. Very nice sharp lens that is too. Zyko lenses were absolutely amazing for the sharpness and the lovely contrasty sharp lenses. Really well made, and you could take some amazing photos with them. So that again is their OM10. The lenses, again, just on the subject of the lens, they're bayonet fitting lenses. To release the lens, the button here was the lens release button. You just held that down and rotated the lens counterclockwise as it faced you, and off it would come, say, a bayonet mounting lens. And what was unique about the Zyko lenses was that they actually have two buttons on them. One of them is the lens release button, but if you look on round, they had another button, and that was a depth of field preview button. So that if you wanted to check the depth of field in your photograph, you just pushed that button down and it closed the aperture down on the lens, so that you could have an idea of the depth of field. You could look at the depth of field that you were getting for any given aperture by using that preview button. So that's what that was. It's quite a unique feature to the Olympus Zyko lenses that the depth of field preview button wasn't on the camera, it was actually on the lens itself. So quite a unique feature of the Olympus Zyko lenses. So again, to reattach the lens, there's a little red marker on the lens, and this lined up with the red dot on the throat of the lens. You lined those two dots up together and then rotated the lens, this time clockwise, to lock it into position. So that was the OM10, as I say, launched in '79. Aperture priority only as it came out of the box. But again, if you wanted, you could have bought the manual adapter for the camera, which was an Olympus accessory, and you could add that to the camera to increase the versatility of the camera and offer the option of manual exposure as well as auto exposure. So a great little enthusiast camera. I love it. I have several of them. I mean, you can pick these up as cheap as chips on eBay and other auction sites. The body itself is quite sturdy, and you can pick them up quite cheaply. The only thing I would say about them is that they do have a bit of a reputation for the shutter magnets failing on them, but generally speaking, if you buy one that is still going, it doesn't have that problem. It's just that if the camera sits about for a long time and isn't used, the shutter magnets tend to stick together on the camera, and the shutter ceases to operate properly. So if you are getting one of these cameras, say if you can have a look at it first, just to check that it's operating okay, because they did have a slight problem that if you didn't use it, you would lose it, kind of a thing with the OM10. You have to keep using it, and if you have one, just operate the shutter from time to time to make sure that the shutter magnets don't sit for a long time, because they will tend to stick if you don't actually use the camera. So a point to remember there. Other than that, they were very reliable little workhorse, very sturdy. A nice build to them. Took a lot of the Olympus, took all the OM Zyko range of lenses. Say this one that's on that one is a 50mm. That one has a 28mm wide angle on it. This one has the 135 short telephoto on it. So great range of Zyko lenses on the OM10s. Again, the flashes, it would take any of the T-series flashes, either the T20 or the T32. Again, it could take the Olympus winders as well. So if you wanted to add a motor wind to the camera, you could. So very versatile and a great enthusiast's camera, a great starter camera for anybody that was starting out in photography. I came to them a little bit late. The first camera, Olympus OM camera I had, was actually an OM20, which was a later derivative of this one. It didn't need a manual adapter because it had manual exposure built in along with aperture priority. But the OM10, as I say, as it came out of the box, it didn't come with that little adapter. That was an accessory that you had to buy if you wanted to convert the camera to manual exposure as well as aperture priority. So well worth buying that little accessory, because it did increase the versatility of the camera a lot more than just basic aperture priority. You can still pick those up, as I say, on sites like eBay and that. They're still available, the OM10 manual adapter, if you want to get one for your OM10. But a lovely little body, a little camera body, handles really well, a nice smooth wind on to it, nice shutter sound as well. And as you can see, even if the camera was in the off position and you forgot to move the metering to the on position, the camera would actually still expose properly. But you wouldn't get a readout in the viewfinder. So if you actually put the camera up to your eye and took a shot and the switch was in the off position, the camera would actually still take the shot, no problem. You just wouldn't get a readout in the viewfinder. As I say, the viewfinder in this camera, you just had a shutter speed scale running down the side of the camera, and a little red LED would light up against the shutter speed that the camera was actually selecting. So as I say, if you didn't like the shutter speed that the camera was selecting, well then you could change that by altering the aperture on the lens. And as I say, if you wanted a faster speed, you would open the aperture up. If you wanted to use a slower speed, you would have closed your aperture down to adjust the speed. That's when the camera was set, of course, to its auto exposure, its aperture priority mode. If you wanted to take control of both the shutter speed and the aperture, then as I say, you had to set the camera to its manual adapter setting by using that little lever there, and the corresponding dot on there is now pointing at the manual adapter, as I say. And if you wanted to use the B for the bulb setting, then you move that little white mark up to there pointing towards the B, and then you could use the bulb setting. So as long as you held the shutter button down, the shutter would stay open. So that's really for long exposures, and you would have to have the camera on a tripod with the cable release screwed into the shutter release button to use the bulb setting, because as you'll hear here, the shutter actually stayed open for as long as you held the shutter button down and didn't release until you let go of it again. So that was really for doing long time exposures, the B setting on the camera. But as I say, its default setting was with the little white dot against auto on the control dial there, and this little dot here in the middle. So the camera was set to aperture priority auto. great little camera. I love it. As I say, great enthusiasts starter camera, and still very useful to this very day for anyone who's interested in maybe taking up film photography, because as I say, there's quite a resurgence of interest in film photography. And if you don't want to spend too much on a 35mm single lens reflex camera, well, you can't really go wrong with an OM10, because they're as cheap as chips. Even if you get one that perhaps the shutter magnets have failed in, you can still buy another body, because the camera bodies themselves, they go from anything from about £15 upwards. To get one of the rarer black versions, you'll probably pay a lot more for them. I mean, generally speaking, they start at about 45–50 quid for the body. And the Quartz version is actually quite rare, so they command quite a price, even though the bodies on them now don't work as such, because they were only programmed up to about the year 2000 for the date and all that. And so even if you got one that was actually functioning, the date wouldn't be correct on it, because they weren't programmed that far ahead. But as I say, great little camera, great little enthusiasts SLR camera, 35mm SLR. Great for starting out, and still very useful to this day. So as I say, I hope you've enjoyed the little review of the OM10. I'll say the three variants: the chrome body, the black body, and the quartz body with the data back on the back of it. So as I say, I hope you enjoyed the little review of the Olympus OM10. And as I say, we'll probably do another review. I still have, I think, one more review to do, and that would be on the Olympus OM1, the mechanical camera. But I hope you enjoyed the review of the OM10. Please feel free to leave any comments, suggestions, whatever, and feel free to subscribe to my channel, where I have a few reviews of various other OM 35mm film cameras. But for now, I'll say thank you very much for watching, and happy photography. Bye for now.